I actually did have some difficulty socializing in general, though, because I am on the spectrum. But I didn't know this until recently, because it took about 17 years for me to get a proper diagnosis for autism. I didn't even know the word detransition until it happened to me. But they also told my parents that if I wasn't allowed to transition, then I would be at risk of committing suicide.
Drea Humphrey here with Rebel News, and Chloe's story has hit social media by storm. You can also catch her on many news outlets and broadcasters as people in the public strive to get more answers about the radical trans agenda that seems to be transitioning kids into having rapid gender dysphoria instead of the rare amount that used to have it more genuinely. Now, Chloe believes that there had been adults in her life that said no, especially the medical professionals, when she was convinced she was a boy. If you look at this post here, she says she went and traveled for an interview. She's 18 years old, and she was told that she couldn't stay in the hotel room by herself. And she rightfully questions, then how was it so that she was able to go on puberty blockers, as well as have a double mastectomy years prior to this? And what's even worse is the same medical establishment that rushed little Chloe through medical transitioning did so while failing to properly diagnose her for being autistic. So today I'm going to sit down with Chloe, but first, if you appreciate that we do these types of interviews that the state-backed legacy media tends to ignore, you should know that we don't take a penny from our federal government like 95% of the news outlets in Canada. So if you'd like to support our independent journalism in a fun way, you can do some shopping at our store called rebelnewsstoreplus.com, and we even have some gear that aligns with people who are concerned about this agenda. Now, here is Chloe's story.
Growing up, I was kind of in a lot of ways, I was kind of a stereotypical girl. I mean, I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and I got 2 older brothers, 2 older sisters, and so I had influences from both sexes. I liked playing with dolls and wearing dresses and skirts and things like that. But at the same time, I also had quite a bit of a tomboyish streak in me. And, I liked playing with video games and toy guns. And, as I got older, I found that I started to fit in more with the boys. I actually did have some difficulty socializing in general, though, because I am on the spectrum. But I didn't know this until recently, because it took about 17 years for me to get a proper diagnosis for autism. Growing up, I wasn't the easiest child to raise. I did have some issues with at school with socializing and also paying attention in class. And my parents couldn't really get any help from either our doctors or the school. A lot of times at school, the school staff would flat out refuse to help us. I had like an IEP in place for me, but over the years, all the privileges from it were just kept going away because they weren't using any of the accommodations. And I had a lot of teachers who suggested to my parents, like, your kid might be autistic. She has some pretty classic symptoms, and you might need to get that checked out. But when they tried to get me diagnosed, the doctor just refused to. We couldn't really get like a clear answer. The doctor just said, like, oh no, there's no way that she's autistic. Like, she's socially developed, and she's just too smart to be on the spectrum. And when my parents tried pushing further, they just refused. And instead, they diagnosed me with ADHD because of the unintended symptoms, and they started medicating me when I was 10 years old. And I wasn't I'd say, in a pretty good household. I was in a good situation. I had a roof over my head, and both parents were in the picture. And but I'd have some difficulties in my childhood having to do with mostly with school and fitting in with my peers.
I know that when it comes to girls and being on the spectrum, there are a lot of girls that end up undiagnosed, like it sounds like you were for quite some time. But also when it comes to being transgender, there are a lot of autistic children that end up in that category as well. So take us to that moment where the idea of being gender dysphoric or transgender came to you.
I mean, growing up, I would often hear like my older sisters or like a friend or like an older cousin say stuff like, "Oh, you're such a boy," and I don't know why, but for some reason, I liked hearing that. Like it made me proud. I guess it made me feel like I stuck out, and I kind of thought of boys as stronger, smarter, just generally better than girls, and you know, um, I didn't really get along with other girls, and growing up, I often heard just negative things about the female experience, like about like periods, puberty, just the process of becoming a woman and then eventually aging, going through menopause, and because I never really heard about the good things about being a woman, and I just thought it was something that I didn't want anything to do with, and because I wasn't really like other girls my age, I thought that I started to think, especially as I got older, that maybe there was something wrong with me, and I started to wonder just exactly what it was. Um, when I started using social media. I started seeing like a lot of content around like LGBT, and especially like having to do with like gender identity. Um, this started with my exposure to this. I would say started in online communities around like video games, cartoons, and comics and things like that that I was interested in. There just so happened to be like a lot of teenagers and young adults who identified as, say, bisexual or non-binary, and then eventually, the algorithms on the social media I was using started to shift and show me more LGBT focused content, um, either having to do with sexual orientation or gender identity, and I was 11 or 12, and it was at a time when I was kind of starting to, I was hitting puberty, and I was kind of like starting to like feel my way out like into the world and wonder just what role I would play. And naturally, after being exposed to this kind of thing, I started to wonder how it might apply to me, like whether I might be who I'm attracted to or what my identity is. And I kind of did switch between labels before I eventually settled on maybe I'm not a girl and I'm actually a boy. And I also it's worth mentioning that I also had some body image issues. I've always kind of been on the thin side. I had family members and sometimes friends at school even make comments on this, and I grew up in an age that's very, very image oriented, and as I started to use social media, I saw the specific body type, like hourglass or like pear shaped women who had very large hips, large breasts, and there is this. I felt like I just couldn't match up to it, and I started to feel like I looked like a boy even because I liked having my hair short and I was a bit on the muscular side. I didn't really have developed hips, and eventually I just decided that maybe I would just be better off as a boy. And by learning about, by seeing all this content about gender identity and transitioning and the process around it, it just, to me, things just kind of clicked. I thought it made sense that this was the way for me.
tell us a little bit about where your parents were when you were coming to this view. Were you communicating with them as you were on these games and if in these different online activities and letting them know along the way, or were they kind of blindsided?
They actually didn't know about this. But I had pretty much unrestricted access to the internet. They weren't really monitoring me, and so they didn't really know what exactly I was looking at. But I didn't really tell them about it. I kind of just for a few months, I kind of just like felt. I just kind of experimented a little bit, started cutting my hair slowly over time, and buying more clothes from the boys section. And eventually I told my older sister, some people at school, and then one day I decided that I wanted to go through the process of actually medically transitioning, and I knew that I would have to do that for my parents and get them on board with it. And so I decided to come out to them in a letter, basically just saying that I wanted them to refer to me by the name Leo, and call me their son, and basically just help me out. And at first they were accepting but cautious. They wanted to make me feel comfortable and accommodate me, but they also didn't know what exactly to do with me, and they saw it as like a mental health issue, and they decided that they would get who they saw as the professionals involved, and take me to a therapist.
So what age were you when you started to get the medical help that led you down the path of medically transitioning?
I think I was 12 when I got the dysphoria diagnosis, and then it was only a matter of half a year, give or take. And so I actually started getting medicalized, which started with the puberty blockers at 13, and then a month or so later, I started on the testosterone. It wasn't a very rigorous process, and there was really only one physician who pushed back on this, and it was the first endocrinologist who I had been referred to. He cited that he cited concerns for my brain development because I was so young. I might have actually been one of the youngest patients that he had seen for this issue, and he basically said, like, this might be dangerous because of your age. Like, you should wait it out and maybe come back later. But I was pretty much immediately after just referred to another endocrinologist who, after about 2 or 3 appointments, gave me the consent forms for the blockers, and then after I started on those, I signed off on me and my mom signed off on the ones for the testosterone.
And you also had a double mastectomy as well, correct?
Yeah, I was 15. This was after my sophomore year.
Were there ever any thoughts in your mind, or maybe you can share what you know of your parents, that you would in fact one day want to detransition, or did you just think this was going to be the path that you were on for the rest of your life?
Up until a few months after my mastectomy, I was completely sure about this. I genuinely believed that I was actually a boy despite being biologically female. But my parents, at the beginning, they did have a few concerns, and my dad especially, he wanted me to wait until I was 18. He wanted me to be happy, but he didn't think that this was really... He wanted to leave the responsibility to me when I was an adult and more developed and capable of making this kind of decision, but they were basically coerced into allowing this to happen by the medical professionals because they were never really presented any options. When my dad asked about the rates of regret, they told him, like, oh, there's less than a 1 or 2% regret rate, and they never talked about what going off of hormones or the process of detransition looked like. I didn't even know the word detransition until it happened to me. But they also told my parents that if I wasn't allowed to transition, then I would be at risk of committing suicide.
Yeah, and we've heard that before as well. But you are speaking out quite bravely. internationally. And where did that come from? Where did the courage to be able to tell your story, even though I see you get a ton of backlash for doing so, some really hateful stuff is said to you online from people who are not happy with you sharing your transitioning story. Where did you get all this courage and fight to go ahead and inform people about this anyways?
It definitely wasn't like that at first. I mean, I started getting that kind of backlash pretty soon after I stopped transitioning, actually. Even towards the end when, I started feeling I started slowly feeling the regret creep in, and I started to not like how it made me look. And I would, at that time I was, this is still during the pandemic, and when the quarantines and the restrictions were still pretty stringent in my state. And so I wasn't really allowed to go out. And the pandemic kind of did strain my relationships with other people my age at school. And so I did turn to the internet for making friendships and expressing myself. And I started talking about these feelings online. And there was one person who was also a trans-identified female who started harassing me and telling me that I didn't deserve parents who cared about me enough to let me transition, and basically mocked me for my feelings about it. And once I realized my regret and officially stopped transitioning, stuff like that kind of came full force from multiple people. I had people telling me that some people started to harass me or say that I deserved to feel this, that I knew exactly what I was doing, because I guess in their minds, a 13-year-old is old enough to make that kind of decision. And I was often told that if I kept speaking up, then I would be harming the community of people who were really trans. And, I did believe that, and I didn't want to make anybody uncomfortable. And I certainly didn't want to harm anybody. So I did stop speaking out about it on personal social media for a little bit. But at the same time, I also I was discovering that there are spaces online for people who were in my situation who regretted my transition and or who regretted their transitions and stop the process of either socially or medically transitioning as well. And I did lose a lot of friends, both online and in person, after I stopped transitioning, either because, after I went off the hormones, I wasn't the healthiest person, and I was very emotional, and it did affect a lot of my relationships. But at the same time, I had a lot of stopping my transition did kind of challenge my views on a lot of things, and a lot of my friends weren't really mature enough to really handle the difference in opinions that we had. And eventually I did find a new community of people, and I did over the course of my transition, my relationship with some of my family members was kind of a little bit strained, but I did eventually make up to them, and in reconciling and building new relationships, I became stronger, and eventually I realized that what happened to me is a very real thing, and it's happening a lot more often than people realize, and there's a lot more kids in the situation than people really talk about. I mean, there's been a few adults who have been speaking out on their experience with transitioning, detransitioning, but there haven't really been any people who transition as minors talking about this. And if nobody's really speaking up, then I feel the responsibility to. And I made a Twitter account earlier last year, and at first I kind of just used it as a personal account that wasn't really too serious, but eventually I decided that I wanted to use it for activism and to start speaking out. I never would have guessed that I would have built the as big of a platform as I did, but I'm really thankful that it's turned out this way and that I'm able to do what I'm doing now.
Now, what advice, if any, do you have for parents who maybe just want to be aware of possible signs that their child may in fact be considering transitioning? What advice would you have for parents on that?
I would say the most obvious would be changes in expression, like starting to wear more clothes, either dress more androgynously or wear clothes of the opposite sex, or maybe start or stop wearing makeup, or start styling their hair differently. But you also have to look at how they're doing in school, not only in terms of their grades, but also socially. Like if they have anybody who identifies as trans or non-binary in their friend groups at school, or if their grade performance or their attendance is starting to drop, I'd say that's a pretty telltale sign. Has a phone, has a computer, is using social media, you really have to be vigilant and watch what they're doing on there. Like in terms of what content they're looking at, how long they're looking at it, and who they're interacting with. Especially in this age. I think because of the generational difference, a lot of parents don't really understand the real dangers that the internet poses, especially to children and teens and even young adults. I mean, I wouldn't have transitioned. I wouldn't have known what being transgender was were it not for the internet.
Now, I'll leave everybody with an update on your legal fight if you have one. Not only are you standing up for yourself as a detransitioner or other people in the same situation, you have taken steps in the legal field to do so. So just briefly tell everybody what your fight is and where they can find more information on that.
Yeah, I've decided that I want to sue my healthcare provider, the hospital that did my surgery, and my gender specialist who referred me to the surgeon, my surgeon, and the endocrinologist who put me on hormones. Late last year, we put out a letter of intent to sue, and right now we're still in the 90-day period, so I don't really have any updates on it.
And let's conclude on a message you have for other teens who are maybe feeling like they've made a mistake with transitioning, but it seems a little scary to go back the other way.
Yeah, I understand that fear. It was quite difficult for me, from the shame of admitting that I was wrong to my friends and family, to having to go off of hormones and having to go through the side effects of that, as well as having been on hormones for about 3 years and not really have looked like a girl by the point that I decided to detransition. But it gets so much better, and it's hard to, especially when you're young, to extrapolate that far, but just a matter of months to a year to 2 years makes such a big difference. And the best thing to do really is to wait and just go through with the motions.
Well, Chloe, thanks so much for taking the time to tell our audience of your story, and one that relates to many others. Thanks for being on Rebel News.
Thank you for having me.
If you appreciate that Rebel News publishes important reports like this interview you just saw with Chloe Cole, consider supporting our independent journalism by treating yourself to some of our gear at rebelnewsstore.com. We appreciate your support.